Hi, I'm Ms. B. I'm going to be reading from the section 3 about the Industrial Revolution. I'm reading from the guided reading packet. We're going to go through the questions, the terms, and also the reading. So to begin with, section 3, Industrialization Spreads. The terms and names for this section, sorry about my glasses, the terms and names for this section are stock, which is the right of ownership in a company called a corporation. And the next word is corporation. Business owned by stockholders who share in its profits but are not responsible for its debts. Before you read this section, in the last section, you read about some of the effects of industrialization. In this section, you will see how industrialization spread to other nations. As you read, this recommends using a Venn diagram to compare industrialization in the United States and in Europe. If you choose not to do that, that's okay too. Before we read the next section, we're going to turn to the last page that's called the questions page so that we know what questions we're going to have to answer at the end. The page number at the bottom of the page with questions is 121. So, for the section Industrial Development in the United States, we have two questions. The first one is, what were some favorable conditions that sparked industrialization in both Britain and the United States? So we're going to learn about how the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain or England, and also how it happened in the United States. Question number 2 is, what factors led to the great expansion of U.S. industry in the late 1800s? So as we read this section, listen for when it starts talking about the late 1800s. It's going to talk about industry expanding in the United States, and it's going to talk about factors, reasons why industry expanded. So we're going to be writing down the reasons why the industry expanded. And now I'm going to read the section itself. Industrial development in the United States. How did industrialization begin in the United States? Other countries began to industrialize after Great Britain. The United States was one of the first. Like Britain, the United States had a great deal of coal and water to create power. There was also plenty of iron. In addition, the immigrants that came to the United States created a large supply of workers. The United States also benefited from conflict with Britain. During the War of 1812, Britain stopped shipping goods to the United States. As a result, American industries began to make many of the goods that Americans wanted. In the United States, industrialization began as a textile industry. In 1789, Samuel Slater, a British worker, brought the secret of Britain's textile machines to North America. Slater built a machine to spin thread. In 1813, a group of Massachusetts investors built textile factories in Waltham, Massachusetts. Just a few years later, they built even more factories in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts town of Lowell. Thousands of workers, mostly young girls, came to these towns to work in the factories. American industry first grew in the Northeast. In the last decades of the 1800s, industrial growth spread to other areas of the nation. This boom was fueled by large supplies of coal, oil, and iron. New inventions, including the electrical light, also helped. As in Britain, railroad building was also a big part of American industrial growth. Businesses needed huge sums of money to do big projects. To raise money, companies sold stock. Stocks are shares of ownership in a company. All those who held stocks were part owners of the company. This form of business organization is called the corporation. How did industrialization begin in the United States? Take a minute and pause the video and write answers to that question. Afterwards, you're going to want to go to the second page and answer the questions, or the third page, that are, what were some favorable conditions that sparked industrialization in both Britain and the United States, as well as the question, what factors led to the great expansion of the U.S. industry in the late 1800s? So pause the video, and I will keep reading later. All right, I imagine that you've paused it by now. We're going to move on to the next section. Continental Europe industrializes. As, as before, we're going to look at the questions that we'll be looking for answers. So on that last page, there are two questions. Question number 3, how did the Napoleonic Wars affect the development of industry in Europe? And question number 4, how would you characterize the expansion of industry throughout Europe during the early 1800s? So that first question is looking for a connection between the Napoleonic Wars and the development of industry in Europe. And then that second question is asking you to explain the expansion of industry in the early 1800s. So the early 1800s, what was the expansion of industry like? And let's take a look at the actual section. Continental Europe industrializes. Where did industrialization begin in continental Europe? Industrial growth also spread from England to the European continent. Belgium was the first to industrialize. It was rich in iron and coal and had good waterways. Germany was divided politically until the late 1800s. As a result, it did not develop much industry at first. However, the Ruhr Valley in western Germany was rich in coal. The Ruhr Valley eventually became a leading industrial region. Across Europe, small areas began to change to the new industries. Industrial growth did not occur in France until after 1830. It was helped by the government's construction of a large network of railways. Some countries, such as Austria-Hungary and Spain, faced transportation problems that held them back from industrializing. Which nations industrialized first, and why? So you're going to answer that question. Moving on to the next section, the impact of industrialization. The questions that go with this on the last page are, how did industrialization shift the world balance of power? So power between the different countries in the world was affected by industrialization. Who had power before and who had power after industrialization? Question number 6. In what ways did industrialization benefit society? So how was it good? How was it good for society? And let's read that section. The impact of industrialization. How did industrialization change the world? The Industrial Revolution changed the world. Countries that industrialized gained more wealth and power than those that did not. The countries of Europe soon began to take advantage of lands in Africa and Asia. The Europeans wanted to use these lands as a source of raw material for their factories. European merchants saw the people on other continents as little more than markets for European goods. The European nations took control of the lands in many areas of the world outside of Europe. This practice is called imperialism. The Industrial Revolution that took place in the 1700s and 1800s changed life forever in the countries that industrialized. Problems caused by industrialization led to movements for social reform. So how did industrialization lead to imperialism? And remember that imperialism is when nations take control of lands outside of the country that they're in. That's all.